If you grew up in Western Canada, you knew the buffalo head before you knew what it stood for. Calgary Beer, the buffalo in the horseshoe on the bottle your father set on the table after a 10-hour shift. The one that cut the prairie dust out of his throat on a hot Stampede afternoon. Behind that label was Alberta's first brewery, a brick fortress on the Bow, a self-contained town of 16 buildings that taught the province to grow its own barley. It survived 8 years of prohibition, survived the Depression, survived 2 world wars, and every rival that tried to break its grip on the West. And then, after 102 years of brewing in Calgary, the plant went quiet for good. How does a beer that survived everything simply disappear from the city that made it? What happened? Chapter 1. The Veterinarian and the Vanished Herd. The story begins on a frontier that had just buried its own past. By the early 1880s, the great buffalo herds that had moved across the southern Alberta plains for thousands of years were gone, hunted out, starved out, vanished in the span of a single generation. The Blackfoot and the Tsuut'ina, who had built their world around those herds, watched the grass empty of the animal that had fed it. And into that emptied country, in 1884, came a young man from Montreal who would one day take the head of that vanished animal, set it inside a horseshoe, stamp it on a bottle, and make it the most recognized symbol in all of Western Canadian beer. His name was Alfred Ernest Cross. He was 23 years old. He was the eldest of 7 children, the son of the Chief Justice of the Court of Queen's Bench of Quebec, Anglo-Montreal aristocracy, the kind of family that sent its boys to private schools and then across the ocean to finish them. Cross spent 3 years at school in England before he came home and qualified as a veterinary surgeon, trained at the Agricultural College in Guelph and at the Montreal Veterinary College. He had a profession, a name, and every reason to stay east. Instead, he went as far west as the rail would carry him. The Canadian Pacific Railway had reached Calgary only the year before. The country he stepped into was raw, a ranching frontier opened by the railway and the tariff policy that was pulling capital and settlers onto the prairie. Cross took work on the British-American ranch near Cochrane, doing whatever the outfit needed. Veterinarian one day, bookkeeper the next, ordinary ranch hand the day after that. He learned the cattle business from the ground up, in the saddle, in the cold. And then, in 1885, or perhaps the year after, the records disagree, he started his own. He called it the A7. The name was a small private joke. He was the oldest of 7, and so the ranch carried his place in the family like a brand. He stocked it with pedigreed Shorthorn and Hereford cattle, the best bloodlines he could bring west, on grassland in the foothills near Nanton. More than a century later, the A7 is still a working ranch, still in the hands of his descendants, one of the oldest in all of Western Canada never to have left the founding family. A.E. Cross might have lived and died a cattleman. But the prairie had other plans, and they began with a fall from a horse. The injury was serious enough that the relentless physical labor of ranching became difficult. A lesser man might have retired on his land and his name. Cross looked around instead. What he saw on that dusty frontier was a town full of what the locals called rot gut and firewater, raw, dangerous, terrible liquor, and not one reliable source of decent beer. He saw a gap, so he went back east, took a brewer's apprenticeship in Montreal, learned the craft from men who had been making beer for generations, and returned to Calgary with a diploma in his pocket and a plan in his head. The timing was almost suspiciously good. A local prohibition had just been repealed in 1892, and the door to legal brewing swung open at the exact moment Cross was ready to walk through it. He did not do it alone. A man building something this big needed money and standing, and Cross had spent 8 years collecting both. He gathered rancher friends and the leading citizens of Calgary as shareholders. Among them was William Roper Hull, English-born, a cattle king and meat packer and real estate developer who would put up Calgary's grain exchange and its opera house, along with the Cochrane interests, the same ranching family Cross had worked for when he first came west. To draw the plans, he hired Otto Wolff, a brewery architect all the way from Philadelphia, a specialist who knew exactly how a building like this was supposed to breathe. On the 12th of March, 1892, they incorporated the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company. It was the first brewery in what was then the Northwest Territories, the first in a country that would one day be the province of Alberta. It was an enormous bet on a town that barely existed. Calgary in 1892 was a few thousand people clinging to a rail line, a place still close enough to its tent and mud beginnings that a man could remember when there'd been no streets at all. To build a brick and sandstone brewery there, on the strength of an Ontario seed crop that hadn't been planted yet and a customer base that hadn't arrived, took a particular kind of confidence. But Cross had read the country correctly. The railway was pulling people west by the thousands. The tariff wall around the young nation's industries was holding, and a frontier full of thirsty men was about to become a frontier full of paying ones. He wasn't building for the Calgary that was. He was building for the Calgary that was coming. There is a detail from those early frontier years that says more about the man than any business record. When Cross was a young rancher, homesick for the tastes of Montreal, his family back east is said to have smuggled treats out to him on the prairie, hidden inside turkeys they shipped across the country, packed in the body of the bird where the cold and the distance couldn't touch them. A Chief Justice's family, mailing comforts to a son who had chosen the hardest possible life, tucking sweetness inside a frozen turkey because it was the only way to get it there. In 1899, Cross married Helen Rothney McLeod, Nell, everyone called her, the daughter of Colonel James McLeod of the Northwest Mounted Police. It was McLeod who had given Calgary its name. So the man who built Alberta's first brewery married into the family of the man who named the city it would stand in. On the frontier, the world was that small, and the people building it were that closely bound. The brewery rose on the east side of town by the Bow River. The malt house went up. The cellars were dug. The kettles were set. And somewhere in that complex of new brick and sandstone, a vat of ale was quietly coming to life, Alberta's first, waiting for the spring of 1893. Chapter 2. Green Beer and Golden Barley. The first batch nearly didn't survive its own popularity. Ale brewing began at the plant on the 12th of March, 1893, 1 year to the day after the company was incorporated. And almost immediately, Calgary discovered it could not wait. The story handed down from those first weeks has the ring of frontier truth. A crowd desperate for beer on St. Patrick's Day descended on the brewery and refused to leave. And Cross, against every instinct a trained brewer has, handed over ale that was still green, unfinished, not yet settled, not yet ready. The town drank it anyway. The hangovers, by all accounts, were memorable. It was the kind of debut a brand could build a century on. The buffalo head inside the horseshoe was registered as the company's trademark, and the flagship lager took the name it would carry for 100 years. Calgary. Calgary Export. The men who drank it just called it Calgary beer, the way you'd name a friend. But a brewery is only as good as what it can put into the kettle, and here, Cross did something that reshaped the agriculture of an entire province. Good beer needs good malting barley, and the prairie wasn't growing it yet. So Cross went and got the seed himself, imported quality malting barley from Ontario, distributed it to Alberta farmers, and then did the thing that made it work. He guaranteed to buy their crop back at 25% above the market price. He took the risk off the farmer's shoulders and put it on his own. Within a few seasons, commercial barley growing had taken root across southern Alberta, an industry that outlived the man, the brewery, and the century, all because a brewer needed something to brew with and was willing to pay for it. That was the pattern of the rise. Every problem solved by reaching out and taking control of the thing that caused it. The brewery needed energy, and in 1910, it became the first commercial customer for natural gas in all of Western Canada, drawing fuel from a well on land owned by Colonel James Walker. Think about that for a moment. The fuel that would one day make Alberta rich, the gas that built Calgary's towers and filled its bank accounts, found its first paying industrial customer in a beer kettle. A brewery's thirst for heat helped light the fuse on the industry that would one day define the province entirely. The brewery needed customers, and so it bought the places customers drank. It absorbed the Golden West Brewery in Calgary in 1910. It would later take the Silver Spray Works and rename it the Big Horn Brewery, and reach all the way to Edmonton to buy the Northwest Brewing Company. And to control where the beer was poured, the company moved into hotels, because, in that era, a hotel was where a working man bought a glass of beer. A subsidiary called the Ranchman's Trust Company was set up in 1912 to handle the buying and the mortgages. And over the years, the chain of hotels tied to the brewery grew until family accounts numbered them in the dozens. Where a Cross hotel stood, a Cross beer was on tap. A farmer might drink Calgary beer, brewed from barley Cross had sold him the seed for, in a hotel Cross owned, heated by gas. Cross had been the first to buy. The loop was closed, and Cross stood at every point on the circle. By now, the city was growing up around the plant. Alberta had become a province in 1905, and Calgary was booming, and the neighborhood that wrapped around the brewery on the east side took on a name that told you everything about what anchored it. They called it Brewery Flats. Today, it's called Inglewood. But for a long time, the brewery wasn't just in the district. The brewery was the district's reason for being. And here is the part that gets left out of the story of any hard-driving frontier capitalist. Cross was, for his era, an unusually decent man to work for. The Calgary Brewing and Malting Company was among the first employers in Alberta to offer its workers a pension plan and insurance against sickness and accident, protections that most Canadian workers wouldn't see for decades. When the First World War came and his men enlisted, Cross held their jobs open for them to come back to. And in 1915, he gave the company's Ogden Hotel to the Red Cross, to be used as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers coming back from the front. There was hard arithmetic underneath all of it, of course. A pension keeps a skilled brewer from walking across the street to a competitor. A held job buys loyalty. But the men who worked the floor knew the difference between an owner who saw them as expendable and one who didn't, and Cross had made his choice clear. The brewery was becoming something more than a business. It was becoming a place that people belonged to. Then, in 1916, the whole foundation fell out from under it. Chapter 3. The Dry Years. On the 1st of July, 1916, Alberta went dry. Prohibition arrived the way these things always arrive, as a moral crusade dressed in the language of progress, and it landed on the brewing industry like a killing frost. Overnight, the single thing the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company existed to make became illegal to sell. There were something like 16 breweries operating in Alberta when the law came down. Most of them would not see the other side of it. For Cross, the dry years were a test of exactly the qualities that had built the place: nerve, control, and the willingness to spend money in the middle of a disaster. He kept the kettles running, but he turned them to other things. The brewery made temperance beer, near beer, brewed, and then stripped of its alcohol, legal and thin, and not what anyone wanted, but something. It made soft drinks under the Buffalo brand, the same Buffalo Head now selling pop to children. It made aerated waters. The plant survived by becoming, for almost a decade, something other than a brewery while remaining one in its bones. And while weaker rivals folded, Cross did what he had always done. He bought them. Failing breweries, struggling hotels. He picked them up cheap, while everyone else was running for the exits, and folded them into the company. Prohibition, which destroyed most of Alberta's brewers, made the survivors stronger. It thinned the field, and Cross made sure he was one of the few left standing in it. He had one real counterpart in that survival. Down in Lethbridge, a German immigrant named Fritz Sick was running the same gauntlet with his own brewery, making the same hard choices, surviving the same way, turning his kettles to near beer and soft drinks, hanging on through the dry years by his fingernails and his stubbornness. Sick had come a long way to lose everything to a temperance law, and like Cross, he refused to. When the dry years finally ended, those two men, Cross in Calgary and Sick in Lethbridge, would walk out of Prohibition holding most of the Alberta beer market between them. The disaster had been a culling, and they were what survived. For the next 40 years, the story of beer in Alberta was, very largely, the story of two families who had refused to die when the law told them to. Prohibition broke in stages. A plebiscite in November of 1923 turned the province against the dry law, and government sales of beer resumed in 1924. After 8 years, the Buffalo Head went back to doing what it was made for. The company that came out of Prohibition was leaner, meaner, and more dominant than the one that had gone in. It had outlasted a law designed to kill it. It had bought up its dead competitors' bones. And it had learned the lesson that would define the next 30 years. Control the supply. Control the barley. Control the hotels. Control everything from the field to the glass. And no outside force can touch you. For a generation, nothing did. A.E. Cross did not see the full flowering of what he'd built. He died on the 10th of March, 1932, of pneumonia following surgery, 2 days short of the 39th anniversary of the first ale he'd ever brewed. His son, James Brayhead Cross, JB to everyone, took over as president and ran the A7 ranch on the side for good measure, carrying both halves of his father's life forward at once. The founder was gone. The fortress he'd built was just entering its golden age. Chapter 4. The Cathedral on the Bow. To understand what the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company became, you have to stand inside it. By the middle of the century, the plant on 9th Avenue had grown into something closer to a small walled town than a factory. 16 separate structures spread across the east side grounds, built up layer by layer since 1892. There was the original malt house and the ale cellars from the founding year. There were the storage cellars from 1903, the brew house and its smokestack from 1905, the office building from 1907. They were built low and solid, 1 to 4 stories, out of sandstone and limestone and brick and corrugated metal. And together, they held the largest concentration of sandstone buildings anywhere in Calgary, outside of Stephen Avenue itself. Someone had even taken one of the oldest houses from the original Calgary town site and moved it, whole, onto the brewery grounds, so that the city's own history sat tucked inside the company's walls. Walk through those gates on a winter morning, and the first thing the prairie gave you was the cold. Calgary winters come down off the foothills hard and dry, the kind of cold that cracks at exposed skin and turns breath to frost on a mustache before a man has crossed the yard. Then, the brewery doors would open, and the world reversed itself. Inside the brew house, the air was warm and wet and heavy, thick with the smell of malt and the low organic sweetness of fermentation, a smell that got into a man's clothes and rode home on the streetcar with him. The kettles threw heat, the copper sweated. And from somewhere came the constant living sound of a working brewery, the hiss of steam, the rumble of the malt mill, the wet clatter of the bottling line. The work moved in a sequence as old as beer itself, and the men who did it took the kind of pride that comes from knowing you're part of a thing nobody else can do. It started in the malt house, where barley, the same barley Cross had taught the province to grow, was steeped and germinated and kiln-dried, and where a maltster judged the roast by smell and feel, the way a baker judges bread. It moved to the brew house, where the mash was made and the wort was boiled and the hops went in. It went down into the cellars Otto Wolff had designed, cut deep and cool, where the lager did the slow, patient work of becoming itself over weeks. And it ended on the bottling line, where the finished beer was run into glass, capped, labeled with the Buffalo Head, and crated for the tavern in the Legion Hall. The cellars were the secret heart of it. A good lager can't be rushed. It needs cold, and it needs time. And on the southern Alberta prairie, where summer could push past 30 degrees, cold was the one thing nature wouldn't reliably give you. Otto Wolff had understood that when he drew the plans back in 1892. He sank the cellars deep into the ground, thick-walled and insulated, so that even in July, a man stepping down out of the heat would feel the temperature fall away with each step, into a still, cool dark that smelled of yeast and damp stone and patience. Down there, the beer waited. A brewer learned to read it, the change in a sample over the days, the moment it turned from raw wort into something a man would pay for. It was craft, not just labor, and the men who did it knew the difference. A Calgary winter shaped all of it. The cellars that kept beer cool in July had to be kept from freezing in January. The men learned to dress for 2 climates at once, the killing cold of the yard and the steam heat of the floor, shedding layers as they came in, pulling them back on the moment they stepped out. Nobody wrote that down for them. You learned it the first week, or you spent the winter miserable. The men on that floor were not, for the most part, names that history wrote down. They were brewers and maltsters and teamsters and bottle line workers, and the precise count of them at the company's peak is one of the things the record simply lost. In its earlier decades, the brewery employed well over 100 people and stood among the largest employers in the young city, and from there, it only grew. They were the kind of men who would tell you, decades later, that they'd worked at the brewery the way another man might tell you he'd served in a good regiment. It was a place worth having belonged to. The day ran by the whistle, the way every industrial day did. Men came in out of the dark in winter, punched the clock, took up their stations along the line that ran from grain to glass. There were Germans on that floor who knew brewing from the old country, and Englishmen, and prairie-born sons of homesteaders. And the talk over the lunch pails carried the accents of half a dozen places that had all somehow ended up in Inglewood making beer. A man could spend 30 years there. A father could bring a son in behind him. The work was hot and wet and hard on the back, and it was steady. And steady was the thing that mattered. Steady meant a house, a family, a Friday paycheck you could count on, the way you counted on the seasons. In a country where so much work was seasonal and uncertain, the brewery offered the rarest thing of all, a wage that didn't stop when the snow came, and what they made traveled further than any of them would ever go. Calgary Export was a crisp, dry Western lager built for a hot, dusty country. The beer a man reached for after 10 hours on a rig or a factory floor, or behind a team of horses, the one that cut the prairie dust out of his throat. It poured in every tavern and every Legion Hall across the West. And from this landlocked plant beside a prairie river, the Buffalo Head shipped out across the Pacific, to China, to Australia, to ports a Calgary brewer would only ever see on a map, the beer of the foothills, drunk on the far side of the world. Chapter 5. The Buffalo and the Town. The Buffalo Head was no longer just a trademark. It had become something closer to a flag. Think about the strangeness of it. The animal had been wiped from these plains within living memory, gone by the time A.E. Cross arrived, to the point of legend. And the company had reached back and taken that vanished animal as its emblem, set it inside a lucky horseshoe, and put it on every bottle and every wall and every delivery wagon in the West, until a whole region looked at the head of an animal it had destroyed and felt instead a flush of pure local pride. The Buffalo Head meant home. It meant the prairie. It meant a cold glass at the end of a hard day. It meant us. That feeling was not an accident. The Cross family had spent 2 generations weaving the brewery into the life of the city until you couldn't easily tell where one ended and the other began. The company put its name and its money behind sport, behind the Calgary Buffalo Athletic Association, behind the kind of community ventures that stitch an institution into the daily fabric of a town. And the family's reach went straight to the symbolic heart of the whole region. Because in the summer of 1912, when an American promoter named Guy Wadick came to Calgary with a wild idea for a frontier celebration, it was A.E. Cross he turned to. Cross, and 3 other men of the cattle country, the rancher George Lane, the meatpacker Pat Burns, and the rancher and politician Archie McLean. Each of the 4 put up $25,000 to guarantee Wadick's gamble. The 4 of them have been remembered ever since as the Big Four, and the gamble they backed was the first Calgary Stampede. The brewer who made the city's beer was also one of the 4 men who made the city's defining festival. You could not draw a line between the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company and Calgary itself, because there wasn't one. And A.E. Cross was woven into the civic fabric in a dozen other ways, besides. He sat as a conservative member of the legislature for East Calgary. He was a founding member of the Ranchmen's Club, the gathering place of the cattle aristocracy. He served as president of the Board of Trade. He helped found the Western Stock Growers Association. And in 1912, the same year as the first stampede, the same year he set up the Ranchmen's Trust to buy his hotels, he founded a company called Calgary Petroleum Products, one of the firms that would seed the entire Alberta oil industry. The brewer was not just a brewer. He was one of the handful of men who, in the space of a single generation, built the institutions of a province out of grassland and nerve. The brewery was the center of it, but the reach went everywhere. Nell Cross, the founder's widow, left her own small mark on how the family was remembered. The telegraph runner boys of Calgary, the story goes, used to fight over who got to carry a delivery to the Cross house, because Nell tipped them generously, and on the bitter days she'd send them around to the kitchen for a cup of hot chocolate before they went back out into the cold. It is a tiny thing, but it tells you the kind of name the family had built. Not just powerful, but warm. The sort of people a frozen errand boy hoped to be sent to. And the dominance was real, not sentimental. For 30 years and more, right up into the 1960s, the Calgary Brewery and Fritz Six Lethbridge operation simply ruled the Alberta beer trade between them. Part of it was quality, and part of it was loyalty, and part of it was the cold mechanics of the hotel system. In those years, a man bought his beer at a hotel, and the breweries owned the hotels, and so the breweries decided what he drank. Cross had built that machine deliberately, hotel by hotel, back through Prohibition and before it. It made the company close to untouchable inside its own province. It was, when you look at it squarely, a kind of empire. Barley at one end, the glass at the other, and everything in between owned or controlled by one family operating out of one brick complex in Inglewood. A rival brewer trying to break into Alberta didn't just have to make better beer. He had to find somewhere to sell it, in a province where the taps were already spoken for. That was the wall Cross had spent decades building, and for 2 generations it held against all comers. The threat to that empire, when it finally arrived, would not come from a better beer or a cleverer brewer. It would come from somewhere the Cross family had never thought to defend. A working family in Calgary in those years might have a father on the brewery floor, a paycheck that came steady as the seasons, a name on a pension plan, and a fridge that held the same beer the father helped make. The brewery was employer, landmark, sponsor, and symbol all at once. It had survived the loss of the buffalo, the arrival of Prohibition, the Great Depression that was grinding through the country even now, and 2 world wars on its way to becoming all of those things. It felt permanent. It felt like part of the landscape, like the foothills and the bow and the Chinook wind that came warm over the mountains in the dead of winter. That is the dangerous moment in any story like this one. The moment a thing feels permanent. Because the family was about to build its grandest monuments to that permanence at the precise moment the ground beneath it began, very quietly, to move. Chapter 6. The Gardens at the Edge of the Fall. J.B. Cross built beautiful things. It started in the depths of the Depression. In 1932, the same year his father died, J.B. began laying out the brewery gardens on the plant grounds, not for profit, but as make-work to keep his men employed and paid through the worst years the country had known. Lawns, flower beds, waterfalls, trout ponds fed by the cool brewery water. A working industrial site softened into a garden because the man who ran it would rather pay his people to build beauty than lay them off. By 1938, he had added a fish hatchery in partnership with the provincial government. The brewery was becoming a destination, a place a Calgary family went on a Sunday. Then came the showpieces. In 1959, J.B. Cross began building an aquarium on the brewery grounds, and when it opened on the 25th of August, 1960, it was the largest saltwater aquarium west of Vancouver, on a site 1,000 kilometers from the nearest ocean, beside a prairie river, behind a brewery. It held alligators. It held piranhas. Generations of Calgary schoolchildren would file through it on field trips, pressing their hands to the glass, in a building put there by the family that made their father's beer. And in 1964 came the last and grandest gesture of all, the Horsemen's Hall of Fame, a museum of Western heritage built on the brewery grounds, its dioramas reaching back to the deep history of the country, including the signing of Treaty No. 7, the agreement between the Crown and the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda that had opened this very land to ranchers like the young A.E. Cross. The company had come full circle. It had built a temple to the history of the place it had grown out of and set it down beside the kettles. These were monuments to permanence. They were a family saying, in brick and glass and water, that this place would always be here, that the brewery and its gardens and its aquarium and its museum were woven so deeply into Calgary that they could never come undone. And they were built at the exact moment the company was slipping out of the family's hands. Because while J.B. Cross was opening his aquarium in 1960 and planning his Hall of Fame, the beer industry beyond the foothills was being remade by forces no garden could hold back. The age of the proud regional brewery was ending. A new logic was coming west, a logic of mergers and rationalization and national brands, of decisions made in distant boardrooms by men who had never smelled malt on a winter morning. The company had grown into a major regional power, but it had not become a national one. And in the business that brewing was about to become, the regional players were not the hunters. They were the prey. The man who embodied that new logic was Edward Plunkett Taylor. E.P. Taylor, an Ottawa-born financier who had spent 3 decades buying up small breweries across the country and folding them into a single giant, closing the inefficient plants, killing off the local brands, concentrating everything into a few big operations, making a handful of national labels. He had done to brewing what the railways had done to distance, collapsed it, consolidated it, made the small and the local into something that simply cost too much to keep. A century-old family brewery with its own gardens and its own aquarium and its own museum was, in the arithmetic Taylor had pioneered, exactly the kind of thing that arithmetic erased. In 1961, 1 year after the aquarium opened, the family sold the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company to E.P. Taylor and his Toronto-based empire, Canadian Breweries. The cathedral to the brand's permanence had just been completed, and control of the brand had just left Calgary for good. Chapter 7. The Arithmetic from Away. The man the Cross family sold to had a method, and the method had a body count. Edward Plunkett Taylor was born in Ottawa in 1901, and starting around 1930, he set about doing to the Canadian brewing industry what almost no one had thought to do. He bought it. One brewery at a time, he assembled more than 20 of them into a single corporation, the Brewing Corporation of Ontario, which became Canadian Breweries Limited, which became, for a time, the largest brewing company in the world. He was candid about what he was doing. He once described his work as trading pieces of paper for other pieces of paper. He once said, with the flat confidence of a man who had counted, that he simply owned the largest piece of the largest piece. But Taylor's real innovation wasn't the buying. It was what came after. He called it rationalization, and it worked like this. You acquired a brewery, you looked at the numbers, and if the plant was small or old or far from the center, you closed it. You fired the people who worked there. You took the brand they had made, the local label that some town had been proud of for 50 years, and you either killed it or you brewed it somewhere cheaper. Taylor took an industry of more than 100 regional brands and consolidated it down to 6. Labatt watched him do it and copied him. Molson watched and copied him too. And by 1965, those 3 companies, Canadian Breweries, Labatt, and Molson, between them brewed roughly 95% of all the beer in Canada. To understand the distance between that man and the brewery he'd just bought, consider what else Taylor was doing in 1961. On his breeding farm in Ontario, a foal was born that year that he would race under his own colors, a small, overlooked colt named Northern Dancer, who would go on to win the Kentucky Derby and become the most influential racehorse of the century. That was the scale Taylor lived at. National brands, continental bloodlines, the largest pieces of the largest pieces. A century-old brewery on the edge of the prairie was not a passion to a man like that. It was an entry in a portfolio, and that, more than any single decision, is what had changed. In 1961, the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company became one more piece of paper in Taylor's hand. For a couple of years, the change was almost invisible. James Brayhead Cross stayed on as president until he retired in 1963. The founder's son, presiding over a company that no longer belonged to his family, in a building his father had raised brick by brick. The buffalo head still went out on the bottles. The men still came in by the whistle. From the floor, you might not have noticed that anything had happened at all. But when J.B. Cross stepped down in 1963, the last thread connecting the brewery to the family that built it was cut. For 70 years, there had been a Cross at the head of the company, A.E. from 1892 until his death in 1932, and J.B. for the 3 decades after. They had been the kind of owners who built gardens to keep men employed in the Depression, who held jobs open for soldiers, who put pensions on the books before the law required them. Whatever else they were, they had a face and a name and a stake in the town. After 1963, the company had owners. It no longer had a family, and an owner, unlike a family, can always walk away. But everything had happened. The decisions about the Calgary plant were no longer made in Calgary. They were made in Toronto now, by men who had never walked the cellars, who knew the brewery only as a line in a ledger and a number on a map. This is the thing the eulogist has to say plainly. The plant did not begin to die because the beer got worse, or because Calgarians stopped drinking it. It began to die because the question being asked about it had changed. The question was no longer, how good is this beer? The question was, how does this plant compare to our other plants? And that is a question a 100-year-old brewery in a single province can only lose. This was the branch plant condition, and it was an old Canadian story long before it reached Inglewood. A national company keeps its head office in one city, and its plants scattered across the country. And when the time comes to cut, the plants that go first are not the worst ones. They are the smallest, the most remote, and the ones whose closure will cost head office the least grief. A prairie brewery, 2,000 kilometers from Toronto, with no executive who lived nearby and no boardroom seat to defend it, checked every box. Distance, which had once protected the Calgary plant, too far for an Eastern brewer to bother competing, now did the opposite. It made the place easy to forget. And a plant that is easy to forget is a plant that is easy to close. There was a second blow, and it came from the provincial government, and it cut away the very foundation A.E. Cross had built his fortress on. In 1957, Alberta required its breweries to divest themselves of their hotels. The captive distribution machine, the chain of hotels that meant a Cross beer was on tap wherever a Cross hotel stood, was dismantled by law. Through the 1960s, the hotels were sold off. The wall that had made the company untouchable inside its own province came down, brick, by order of the legislature. And once the wall was down, the only thing keeping the Calgary plant economically alive was a rule almost nobody outside the industry had ever heard of. There is a hard symmetry in that. The company had survived prohibition by buying up hotels, by tightening its grip on where the beer was poured until no rival could squeeze in. That grip had been its armor for 40 years. Now the government had pried the armor off, just as ownership passed to men who had no loyalty to the place and every incentive to ask whether it was worth keeping. The strength Cross had built turned out to depend on conditions that could be voted away in a single legislative session. And they were. That rule was simple, and it was everywhere in Canada. The provinces effectively required that beer be brewed in the province where it was sold. It was protectionism, plain and old, and it had an enormous consequence. It forced the big national brewers to keep a brewery in every province, no matter how small or how inefficient, because they couldn't sell beer in Alberta unless they made it in Alberta. That rule was the reason the Calgary plant still ran. Not its history, not its barley, not its buffalo. A line in provincial liquor regulation. Take that rule away, and the entire argument for brewing beer in Calgary disappeared overnight. Nobody on that factory floor knew it yet. But the rule was about to go. Chapter 8. The Men Who Owned the Paper. The years that followed were a slow handing down of the company, through hands that held it more loosely each time. In 1969, Canadian Breweries was bought by Rothmans, the tobacco group, and E.P. Taylor's long association with the empire he'd built came to an end. The new owners had no particular feeling for beer. They were a cigarette company that now happened to own breweries, and a prairie lager with a buffalo on the label was about as far from their attention as a thing could get. In 1973, they renamed the whole brewing operation Carling O'Keefe, after its 2 biggest national brands, and the Calgary name became what it would remain for the rest of its corporate life. A regional label inside a national portfolio. A small line item brewed in a plant that head office viewed with growing impatience. Look at what had happened to the name itself. A.E. Cross had built Calgary beer into the proud flag of a region, the beer of the Stampede, the Buffalo of the West. Now it was a stock-keeping unit. The men who set the company's direction thought in terms of Carling and O'Keefe, the national workhorses, and Calgary was a local curiosity that came with the plant. The beer that had been an empire was now a brand, and a brand can be moved. Then the owners got further away still. In early 1987, an Australian conglomerate called Elders IETL, the company behind Foster's Lager, bought control of Carling O'Keefe. The man behind it was Elders chairman, John Elliott, and he wanted a foothold in the North American beer market. He got it for around $18 a share, a deal worth roughly $196 million, closed in the last days of February. Before long, Foster's was being bottled in Canadian plants. Elliott was a brash and ambitious operator, a man who thought in continents and acquisitions, and the Canadian breweries were to him what the Calgary plant had been to Taylor, a position on a global board. Now the chain of command ran from a brewery in Inglewood, up through a head office in Toronto, all the way to a boardroom in Melbourne. On the far side of the same Pacific Ocean, the Buffalo Head beer had once been shipped across in its glory days. The branch plant had become a branch of a branch of a branch. Every link added to that chain put another 1,000 kilometers between the men who made the beer and the men who decided whether they still would. And then came the merger that decided everything. In 1989, Molson and Carling O'Keefe combined their Canadian brewing operations into a single company, Molson Breweries, owned in equal halves by Molson and by Elliott's Elders IETL. On the Molson side, the deal was driven by Marshall Cohen. Mickey Cohen, a former senior federal civil servant brought in to run Molson the year before. The merger vaulted Molson from a 34% share of the Canadian market to 51%. On the Elders side, John Elliott wanted the scale and the path toward the American market. Two empires of paper folded into one. Consider the man making the calculation on the Molson side. Mickey Cohen had been a deputy minister in Ottawa. He had helped run the finances of an entire country before he ever ran a brewery. He was not a beer man. He was a numbers man, and what the numbers told him was simple and merciless. The merged company now owned far more brewing capacity than it could possibly use. There were 16 plants where the country needed perhaps half that many. Some were running far below what they were built to produce. The Carling Brewery in Toronto, by one account, was operating at only 40 to 50% of capacity. You cannot run a business that way. Empty capacity is money set on fire. And the only way to stop the burning was to close plants. The purpose of the merger was stated out loud, and it was not growth, it was subtraction. Elliott said it plainly when the deal was announced. Canada had far too many plants, built up over years by regulation, and the new company needed efficient ones. On the 25th of January, 1989, the merged company confirmed what that meant in human terms. It would close 7 of its 16 Canadian plants. It would cut roughly 1,400 jobs through layoffs and attrition over 3 years. And it would pour $185 million into the plants that survived, in Toronto, in Quebec, in Vancouver, the ones judged worth keeping. The new company would hold about 52% of the Canadian market against Labatt's 42%, and it would rank as the 6th largest brewer in all of North America. Picture how an announcement like that lands. A number read out in a press release in the East, 7 plants, 1,400 jobs. And somewhere west of it, in towns the people reading the release have never visited, men come home and tell their wives they think the brewery might be on a list. Nobody can say which list, or when. The waiting is its own kind of damage. You keep working, you keep brewing good beer, and you wait to find out whether the math has decided you're worth keeping. Here is the strange mercy in the timing, and the cruelty hidden inside it. The Calgary plant was not on that first closure list. The plants named in 1989 were elsewhere: Lethbridge, Winnipeg, downtown Toronto, Saskatoon, St. John's, Vancouver, Montreal. Calgary survived the first cut, which meant the men there got to keep working and keep hoping for a few more years, while the logic that had already condemned plants like theirs went on quietly running in the background. And notice what the merger really was, seen from a distance. 30 years earlier, E.P. Taylor had invented the model. Buy the breweries, close the inefficient ones, concentrate the brands. He had done it to small regional plants like Calgary's, had in fact done it to Calgary's. Now that same logic had grown so large it was eating the consolidators themselves. Carling O'Keefe, which was what Taylor's empire had become, was being folded into Molson, and the combined giant was closing 7 of its own plants. The wheel Taylor set spinning in the 1930s had come all the way around. Rationalization had no final resting point. It just kept reaching for the next plant, and the next, until there was almost nothing regional left to consume. The cuts came not as a single blow, but as a slow bleed. Layoffs and attrition over 3 years, the announcement had said, which meant the dying was designed to be gradual. A man here, a shift there, a department wound down, so that no single day carried the full weight of 1,400 lost jobs. It is easier for a company to close a plant slowly. The grief comes in installments. The headlines, if there are any, are smaller. And the men inside spend those 3 years watching the place thin out around them, learning to read the signs, the orders that slowed, the shifts that disappeared, the parts that stopped arriving. Long before anyone in an office confirmed what they already knew. There is a vocabulary for all of this, and the vocabulary is part of how it gets done. Rationalization, overcapacity, efficiency, attrition. These are clean words, accounting words, words with no smell of malt and no faces attached to them. A plant is not closed, it is rationalized. Men are not fired. The workforce is reduced through attrition. The language is built to let a decision travel from a boardroom in the east to a factory floor in the west, without anyone along the way having to picture the man who knows the cellars in the dark. That is not a conspiracy. It is just how a company the 6th largest in North America talks to itself about a plant it has never seen. Because the last support was about to be kicked away. For decades, the brewed-in-province rule had been the only economic reason to keep a brewery in Calgary at all. In 1991, that rule met its end. After a challenge from the United States, a GATT trade panel ruled against Canada's beer protectionism. The report was adopted that October. The 2 levels of government agreed to dismantle the system, to end the discriminatory treatment of imported beer by the summer of 1992, and to give imported beers equal access to store shelves by the autumn of 1993. The wall came down, and it came down at the worst possible moment, just as the merger had created enormous overcapacity. Too many plants, all suddenly free to ship beer anywhere. There is no villain in this part of the story, and that is what makes it so hard to bear. The trade ruling was not aimed at Calgary. The men who fought the protectionism saw only an unfair barrier and a chance to open markets. But the barrier they tore down was the same one that had quietly justified a brewery in every province. And when it fell, the logic that had spared the Calgary plant fell with it. A national brand could now be brewed in one big efficient plant and trucked across the country. There was no longer any law, any market, any reason on a spreadsheet that required beer to be made in Alberta for Albertans to drink it. One Molson executive, a senior vice president named Barry Joslin, put the company's mood into a single sentence in 1990. They had to meet the future, he said, instead of sticking their heads in the sand. The future for the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company meant this: a national brand could now be brewed anywhere and shipped everywhere. The one rule that had required beer to be made in Alberta was gone. And a century-old complex of 16 brick and sandstone buildings scattered across the east side of Calgary, buildings that had to be heated against a prairie winter, maintained, worked around, was now simply a plant that compared poorly to a modern high-volume line somewhere else. The math was not cruel. The math was just the math. Old buildings, high costs, a small market, no protective rule, and a sister plant up the highway in Edmonton with room to spare. Run those numbers, and only one answer comes back. The men in the boardroom didn't hate the place. They had probably never seen it. That was the whole point. The decision, when it came, would arrive the way these decisions always arrived in a branch plant country, from somewhere else, and without asking permission. Chapter 9. The Quiet Decommissioning. In 1992, the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company turned 100 years old. Molson marked the occasion. They relaunched Calgary beer with the old Buffalo Head label, a nod to the century, a tip of the hat to the heritage they now owned. For the anniversary, the Buffalo came home to its bottle. There is something almost tender in that gesture, and something terrible underneath it. For 100 years, that label had meant a working brewery on the bow, the cellars, the whistle, the men. Now it was being brought back as a tribute, a centennial keepsake, a way of selling a memory of itself. The company was celebrating the plant's 100th birthday, the way a family gathers for a portrait it doesn't yet know will be the last one. 2 years later, they closed the plant. The decommissioning came in October of 1994. There was no great public reckoning. After the centennial celebration, the shutdown arrived as a corporate decision rather than a civic event, a line item executed quietly, the way the new owners did things. And here, the historian runs into a wall. We know the plant closed in October of 1994. We know it was 102 years old. But the rest of it, the part that should be the beating heart of this story, is missing from the public record. We do not have the name of the last brewmaster. We do not have the name of the plant manager who locked the doors. We do not know the union local, or how many men lost their jobs that autumn, or what any of them said as they walked out for the last time. That silence is its own kind of evidence. When the GM plant closed in Oshawa, the country watched. When the cod fishery died in Newfoundland, it made the national news for years. But a 102-year-old brewery, the first in the province, a fortress of local pride, a place that had survived Prohibition and the Depression and 2 world wars, went dark in Calgary in 1994, with so little public noise that the names of the people it took down with it were never properly written anywhere a person can easily find them. So we have to imagine them, because the record won't give them to us. Somewhere in that plant in the autumn of 1994 was a man who had come in as a teenager and was now gray, who had given the brewery 30 years, who knew the cellars in the dark and could judge a batch by the smell of it. He had a pension that began the day his father's generation fought for it. He had a house in the neighborhood and a fridge full of the beer he made. And one autumn day, he punched out for the last time. And the whistle that had ordered his days for 30 years didn't sound the next morning, because there was no longer any reason for it to. We don't know his name. The arithmetic that closed the plant had no column for it, and there were more than 100 of him. Maybe many more. The record doesn't say. 100-odd men and their families, each with a version of that last autumn, each walking out of a gate their fathers might have walked through, and not one of those mornings written down anywhere a grandchild could find it. The cod fishery got a moratorium and a national reckoning. Oshawa got cameras at the gate. Calgary's first brewery, 102 years old, got a line in a heritage file and a date. October of 1994. That was nearly all anyone bothered to keep. A closure can be loud, or it can be quiet. The loss is the same size either way. The only difference is whether the rest of the country is looking when it happens. Calgary's was quiet. The Buffalo went down without a sound, and the silence has stood in for the story ever since. The beer didn't die. That's the part that stings. The beer went to Edmonton. Calgary beer production was simply consolidated into Molson's Edmonton plant, where there was room to run it at full capacity. The Buffalo Head label kept appearing on bottles. The men in Calgary, who had made it for 30 years, just weren't the ones making it anymore. The brand outlived the brewery. The name outlived the place. And the workers were the only part of the equation the arithmetic had no use for. To see what that closure must have looked like up close, to put faces on the silence of 1994, you only have to follow the beer to Edmonton and wait 13 years. Because in August of 2007, Molson Coors closed the Edmonton plant too. This time, there were names. This time, there was a fight. The workers went on strike, and the company answered by announcing it would shut the plant for good. 136 people lost their jobs. The president of the union local, KW Local 284, was a man named Garth Sanderson. Among the workers was Doug Smith, who had given the plant 29 years of his life. 29 years. And when it was over, Gil McGowan, the head of the Alberta Federation of Labor, said out loud what the workers were feeling, that this was a profitable, efficient, award-winning plant, and it was being closed anyway, by a company whose decisions were made somewhere far from the floor. A profitable plant, an award-winning plant, closed anyway. That phrase is the whole story of the branch plant in 4 words. It tells you that the question was never really whether the plant was good. The Edmonton plant was good. By every measure that the men who worked there cared about, it was good. It closed because, somewhere on a larger map, a larger calculation had been run. And Edmonton came out on the wrong side of it, the same way Calgary had 13 years before, in a closure so quiet it left no names at all. It was the same logic, the same map, the same ledger, the same question. How does this plant compare to the others, reaching its final conclusion? First, the work left Calgary for Edmonton. Then, it left Edmonton and Alberta altogether. The province that A.E. Cross had taught to grow barley, that had drunk his beer for a century, that had put the buffalo head in every tavern and Legion Hall from the foothills to the prairie, stopped brewing its own beer entirely. And the loss reached past the workers, out into the neighborhood itself. They had called it Brewery Flats. The district had taken its name from the plant, defined itself by the plant, grown up around the smell of malt on the morning air. For 100 years, the brewery was the reason the place existed and the thing the place was named for. After 1994, the name was all that was left. A brewery flats with no working brewery. A district carrying the memory of an industry in its own name, the way a widow keeps a married name long after the husband is gone. And so picture the Calgary plant in its last days, even though no one wrote it down. The seller's Otto Wolf had cut deep into the ground, where the lager had waited patiently for 102 years, emptied for the last time. The kettles cooling. The bottling line stilled. The buffalo head, on the last crate to leave the dock, riding out into the cold. A factory that has run for a century has a sound, machinery, ventilation, the movement of men, a low living hum that becomes part of a neighborhood's own background. When that stops, the first thing you notice isn't the quiet. It's that the quiet is the wrong shape. There's a silence where the sound used to be, and in a Calgary winter, the cold seems to fill it, heavier than ordinary stillness. The men went home. The doors were locked. The gas that the brewery had been the first in the West to burn was shut off at the valve. Molson said it intended to decommission the site. That was the word, decommission. A century of brewing ended in a verb borrowed from the Navy, the kind of word you use for a ship you no longer need. The kettles that had run since 1905 went cold and stayed cold. The complex that had been a living thing, 16 buildings breathing steam and noise and men, became, in the space of a single autumn, a shell. Brick and sandstone and empty air, standing by the bow, waiting for whatever came next. The line had stopped. Nobody pushed a button. The line just stopped. Chapter 10. The Buffalo on the Corner. When a plant closes, 2 things are left behind: the place and the people. The place we can still walk through. The people scattered, and most of them the record never followed. But we know the shape of what they faced, because it was the same shape every closing Canadian plant left behind. A brewer in his 50s in 1994 had a trade, but it was a trade with one employer left in the province, and that employer had just moved the work 280 kilometers up the highway to Edmonton. The skills that had made him valuable for 30 years, judging a batch by smell, running the deep cellars, knowing the rhythm of the line in his hands, were skills the rest of the economy had no use for. Some found other work. Some took early retirement on the pensions the Cross family had written into the books generations before, never knowing they were providing for the men who would outlive the company itself. Some left, the way Albertans have always left when the work does. The brewery had been a place you could spend a whole working life, now that life had nowhere to finish. After 1994, the great brick complex on 9th Avenue simply sat there. A buyer came along with a plan to make xanthan gum on the site, a company called Canzyme. But the plan fell through, and the buildings stayed empty. In 2000, a Calgary financier named Ron Matheson, through his firm Matco Investments, bought the whole thing. And for years, much of it did nothing but wait, and weather, and slowly come apart. Calgary winters are not gentle to an empty building. The freeze and the thaw work at the mortar. Water finds every crack and turns to ice and pries the cracks wider. In 2009, a roof collapsed on part of the oldest section, the 1892 brew house and ale cellars, the 1903 storage cellars, the brew house and racking room from 1905, the original buildings, the ones A.E. Cross had watched go up. Matheson applied for a permit to demolish them. There is a particular cruelty in how this place was lost. The brewery had survived everything the 20th century could throw at a building. It had stood through Prohibition when the law tried to take its reason for being. It had stood through the Depression and 2 world wars. It had stood through every economic storm for 100 years. And then, idle and unwanted, it began to lose. Not to any of those great forces, but to ordinary weather, to rain and frost, and the slow patience of neglect. The fortress that no rival brewer and no economic shock had ever breached was being taken apart, one freeze-thaw cycle at a time, by Alberta winters it had once sheltered its workers against. That was the moment the city decided it would not let the place disappear quietly the way the workers had. The pushback was immediate. In 2010, the Heritage Canada Foundation named the brewery to its list of the country's top 10 endangered places, after it was nominated by the Calgary Heritage Initiative Society, whose president, Cynthia Clausen, welcomed the national attention. A coalition of heritage groups campaigned for the site to be given provincial protection. The province ordered a formal assessment of the building's historical value. And slowly, the project turned, away from demolition, toward something else. There is something worth noticing in the shape of that fight. When the plant closed in 1994 and the workers lost their jobs, the city was largely silent. No campaign, no top 10 list, no coalition. But when the buildings themselves were threatened 15 years later, Calgary mobilized. The brickhead defenders the brewers never got. Perhaps the loss had simply had time to settle by then, time to turn from an economic blow into something a city recognized as part of itself. Perhaps it is always easier to mourn a building than a livelihood. Either way, the place that had been allowed to fall quiet without a fight was not going to be allowed to fall down without one. What emerged was a plan to keep the place by changing what it was for. Matco's development arm, working with the architecture firm Dialogue, drew up the brewery district, a scheme to save the buildings that could be saved and adapt them. The administration building, the boiler and engine room, the smokestack, a grain silo, the old wall of J.B. Cross's fish hatchery. The model was Toronto's distillery district, or Vancouver's Granville Island. The industrial bones kept standing, repurposed, given a second life as something other than what they were built to be. Walk through Inglewood today, and the brewery is still there, in pieces. Parts of the complex are occupied, a storage business, a wine outlet, ordinary tenants moving through rooms where the cellars once held the slow lager. And on the corner of 9th Avenue and 15th Street, the buffalo statue still stands, still looking out over the neighborhood, the way it has for longer than anyone walking past can remember. There is a particular grace note nearby. A.E. Cross's own house, the home he built in Inglewood, survives, restored, designated as a heritage site, and operating now as a restaurant called Rouge. The founder's table is still set. People still gather in his rooms. They just order from a menu instead of a brewing schedule. And Inglewood itself, Brewery Flats, the district the brewery built, has become one of Calgary's most beloved old neighborhoods, and, fittingly, a center of the city's craft beer revival. There are small breweries within walking distance of the old plant now. The Buffalo's neighborhood is brewing again. Just not the Buffalo. Chapter 11. What the Buffalo remembers. Here is the thing about a beer people loved. In 2021, a Calgary craft brewery called Village Brewery licensed the Calgary beer name from Molson Coors and brought it back. Its co-founder, Jim Button, had wanted to do it for years. They put the lager in cans printed with the old buffalo head, retro and unmistakable, and they put it on the shelves. It sold out in 8 weeks. Josh Traptow, who runs Heritage Calgary, spoke for a whole generation when he said he'd always been able to recognize that logo. The bison heads, the horseshoes, the icon that Calgarians simply carry around in their memory. The beer was gone, brewed by other hands in other places, killed off as a major brand decades earlier. And people still wanted it badly enough to empty the shelves in 2 months. The nostalgia wasn't sentiment, it was alive. But the brewery that made it is still gone. The men who knew the cellars are old now, or gone too. The thing that sold out in 8 weeks was a memory in a can. Lovely and real, and not the same as a working brewery on the bow employing the fathers of Inglewood. A revived label gives a city back its taste. It cannot give back the whistle, or the shift, or the steady paycheck, or the thing the brewery had really been. Not a product, but a place where people belonged. The buffalo head outlasted all of it. The animal had been wiped from these plains before A.E. Cross ever brewed a drop, and he had reached back and made its head the symbol of something permanent. A beer, a brewery, a fortress of local pride that would outlast prohibition and depression and war. And in the end, the brewery went the way of the buffalo, not killed by any single hunter, worn down by a change in the world it lived in, by an arithmetic worked out far away, by a wall that came down at the wrong moment, until the great herd of brick buildings on 9th Avenue stood empty and the work had moved on somewhere else. The buffalo statue is still on the corner. The brick is still standing, some of it saved, some of it gone. The beer is back, in a way, in a can that remembers. And on a cold Calgary morning, when the Chinook comes warm over the foothills and the light falls low across Inglewood, you can stand in front of that old complex and feel the size of what it was. Alberta's first brewery, the one that taught the province to grow its own barley and drink its own beer and put a vanished animal back on the map. It made beer here for 102 years. Then the question changed, and the answer came from away, and the buffalo went quiet on the bow.